In the shadows of a once mighty empire, a single man held power greater than any king. But he wore no crown. He carried no sword. Instead, he held a bowl filled with fresh, steaming blood. This was no metaphor. This was the terrifying reality of the blood priest, a figure so feared, so revered, that entire cities surrendered at the mere rumor of his arrival. Children disappeared during the harvest moon. Rivers ran red after new moons. And emperors, powerful, ruthless emperors, bowed in silence, paralyzed by the whispers of a ritual older than the empire itself. Was he a prophet? A demon? A fraud? Or was he something far worse? A man who discovered the darkest part of the human psyche and weaponized it? This is the story of how a blood-soaked ritual brought an empire to its knees, not through war or fire, but through fear, sacrifice, and unholy theater. And it all begins with a scream that echoed through the mountains and never stopped. The mountains were not silent. Not if you listen long enough. The wind didn't just howl, it spoke. And the villagers of Kerith, a forgotten hamlet buried in the northern highlands, had been hearing things for generations. It always began in late autumn, just as the leaves turned black and the livestock grew restless. Whispers, murmurs that crawled down the rocks and into their dreams. They said it was the wind, but it wasn't. That year, the voices grew louder. At first, they echoed only through the caves, ancient tunnels carved by time and myth. But then, something changed. The forest grew still. The birds vanished. And on the night of the blood moon, a child was born without a cry. His mother, pale and trembling, said he opened his eyes before he took his first breath. His gaze was not that of a newborn. It was ancient. It was knowing. They named him Thorin, but the elders had another name for him. Is Veridal, the one foretold in their oldest forbidden texts. The Bloodmouth, the Soul Feeder, the Priest of Dread. Thorin grew, but not like the others. He spoke fluent sentences by the time he was 2. By 5, he could recite scripture that hadn't been read aloud in over a century. By 8, he claimed to have dreams where the gods bled and laughed. The villagers feared him, but they never turned him away, because the drought had ended when he was born, and every harvest since had been bountiful, even when nearby towns starved. They built him a temple, not of marble, but of ash-black stone pulled from the haunted hills, a place where the earth still wept when touched. They said it was cursed. Thorin said it was alive. He began speaking to crowds by age 10, but he didn't preach. He warned of balance, of sacrifice, of blood owed to those beneath. And then he performed the first ritual, a dying goat, a blade carved from bone. Thorin whispered to the animal, slit its throat with unnatural calm, and let the blood pour into the stone bowl before him. When the last drop fell, a sudden quake struck the village, knocking down every tree but sparing every home. From that day on, people stopped calling him a boy. They called him the Blood Priest. Word spread. Travelers came, first to mock, then to witness. They left, changed. Some wept. Some screamed. One man walked into the river and never came back. Thorin began choosing his own followers. He called them the Red Veil, silent, veiled acolytes who never showed their faces and never left his side. Some say they were dead already. Others believed they had no tongues. But all of them obeyed without question. By the time he turned 15, neighboring warlords were seeking his counsel. And one, a particularly brutal general named Focus, asked Thorin to bless a military campaign. Thorin refused. He said, "This victory will cost more than you are willing to give." Focus marched anyway. His entire army, 7,000 men, disappeared in a single night. Not a scream, not a survivor, just pools of blood found days later, shaped into spirals across the battlefield. That's when the Empire noticed. They sent riders to Kerith, but only one returned. He was blind, hair white from shock, and said nothing except, "He does not rule with a sword, but with something far older." The Empire grew quiet, not because it believed, but because it wasn't sure it didn't. And deep in the Blackstone Temple, Thorin prepared his next ritual, one that would be seen by tens of thousands. one that would make them believe, even if it meant bleeding the sky itself. The empire prided itself on being unshakable. Stone columns, iron laws, a legacy carved from war and held together by fear. But all it took was one man in crimson robes to make that fear shift, from the emperor to him. When the High Chamber received the second report, it was dismissed as hysteria. Farmers babbling about eclipses, rumors of mountain witchcraft, until the scroll arrived. It was sealed with wax the color of clotted blood. Inside, a single sentence written in dark brown ink. You will give what is owed, or it will be taken. They burned the scroll. That night, the empress miscarried. She had been healthy, blessed, protected by 7 physicians. And yet, without warning or reason, her womb turned cold. That same week, a crimson mist settled over the western provinces. Crops failed. Livestock turned feral. A priestess was found dead, her tongue nailed to a tree. And still, the emperor refused to acknowledge Thorin. Until the dream came. Witnesses claimed the emperor woke up screaming, his bed soaked with blood that was not his own. He couldn't explain it. The royal guards couldn't explain how his heart had stopped for 7 minutes, and then restarted without intervention. He ordered an audience. But Thorin did not come to the emperor. He summoned the emperor to him, and the emperor went. It was a cold morning when the imperial caravan arrived at Kareth. But they didn't find a village. The homes had been dismantled. The people gone. Only the temple remained, 20 feet tall, pulsing faintly like a living organ under the rising sun. Inside, a single bowl sat at the center. Still wet, still steaming. A voice echoed from nowhere. You are not first. You are not last. You are merely next. The emperor fled. Within hours of his return to the capital, he ordered a platform to be built in the central square for Thorin. Not as a gallows, as a stage. He called it an act of diplomacy. But the whispers said otherwise. 3 weeks later, the blood priest arrived. He came not with guards, but with silence. Veiled acolytes formed a ring around him. No horses, no carts, just footsteps and dread. Tens of thousands gathered to witness the ritual. Some came out of curiosity, others out of fear. But most could not explain why they were there. They just felt compelled. The blood priest stepped onto the platform. He looked at no one. He spoke to everyone. Blood is the oldest agreement. Before coin, before law, before speech. Blood fed the earth. Blood bound the sky. Blood is not death. It is reminder. Then he raised his hands, and the sky darkened. It wasn't an eclipse. There was no celestial alignment. But the sun disappeared, and a low hum began, rising from beneath the stones. The ritual began. A woman from the crowd stepped forward, calm, entranced, and laid herself at his feet. No one moved to stop her, not her family, not even the guards. He drew a blade. The cut was clean. The blood fell into the bowl. And when it did, the crowd moaned, thousands in unison, as if something inside them broke open. Some fainted, others wept. One man laughed until he collapsed and never stood again. And then, the sun returned. Thorin looked out over the square. The silence was suffocating. No one dared breathe too loudly. Even the emperor stood frozen. One drop, Thorin said. That is all it takes. He turned and walked away. No one stopped him. No one dared. In the days that followed, crime in the capital dropped by 78. Markets gave away food without charge. Strangers confessed to unsolved murders. Temples filled with people desperate to repent. Something had changed. Not in law, not in politics. In fear. The blood priest didn't need soldiers. He had something better. Belief, twisted, primal, and unstoppable. But belief, once awakened, demands more. And Thorin was ready to give it. The next ritual would not be voluntary. They called it the Awakening. Not officially, of course. The Empire refused to document the event in its records. But the people knew. They whispered it in alleys, carved it into trees, painted it in blood on the doors of temples. The blood priest had performed a miracle, or something far worse. And now, across the Empire, the lines between devotion and delusion blurred. Merchants in northern provinces abandoned their stalls to build shrines of bones. Teachers in the capital began speaking in tongues mid-lesson, and entire farming communities stopped planting crops and started offering animals to the earth, chanting in unison, one drop, one debt, one voice. What had started as superstition became ritual, and what had been ritual was now law. The emperor, though still on the throne, had become a hollow figure, governed not by advisors or generals, but by dread. He issued no commands unless Thorin's acolytes approved them. Even war taxes were deferred because the Red Veil declared, "Blood has already been paid this season," and no one argued. But fear, when left unchallenged, grows wild, and wild fear turns to hysteria. That winter, the southern provinces began a mass ritual of their own, not one led by Thorin, but one in his name. 52 citizens, one each day. Each slit their wrists over a sacred bowl and sang the verses of Bleeding Sky, a passage believed to be dictated by Thorin himself in a trance. On the 53rd day, every bird in the region dropped dead mid-flight. Hundreds of corpses. No explanation. Then came the Red Rain. Reports flooded the capital of a storm falling over the coastal region. Rain the color of fresh blood, thick, salty, and warm. It killed crops, corroded tools, and left the land scarred. Priests claimed it was a punishment for improper offering order. Still, no one questioned the blood priest. He had not spoken publicly since the capital ritual. He hadn't needed to. His silence spoke louder than any decree. It was the silence of inevitability. But behind temple doors, something was brewing. Thorin's acolytes had begun selecting families, not for punishment, but for preservation. They said the offering day was coming, that it would be a cleansing, and only those chosen would survive the crimson eclipse. No one knew what that meant, until the Red Veil descended on the Great Plains. They carried no weapons, but entire towns fell to their knees at the sight of them. On the 18th night of the month of Embers, the largest gathering in imperial history occurred. Over 80,000 citizens standing barefoot in silence, facing the Blood Priest platform. No one was ordered. No one was paid. They came because they believed. And Thorin finally returned. This time, not in robes, but naked from the waist up, his skin marked with dozens of crimson symbols, glowing faintly in the moonlight. He bore a crown of dried blood, hardened like bark. He spoke once. "When you kneel, you are not weak. You are awake." Then he raised the bowl. A child stepped forward, no older than 10. She was calm, smiling, willing. No one knew her name. Some believe she was the firstborn after Thorin's first ritual. Others said she was an orphan raised by the Red Veil. But all remember the moment her blood touched the bowl. The ground cracked. Not an earthquake. Not a tremor. A perfect line split the platform in half, straight down the middle, as if the earth itself had been cut by an invisible blade. The crowd gasped, but no one ran. Instead, they bowed lower. And that's when it became clear this was no longer a performance. It was doctrine. Entire regions rewrote their laws to align with Thorin's teachings. Courts required blood oaths. Marriages were sealed with shared wounds. Even executions were replaced with rituals of red forgiveness, where the condemned offered their blood and were pardoned if the earth did not shake. One senator who opposed the rituals died in his sleep, his heart missing from his chest without a single incision. Another vanished, the walls of his home covered in spirals drawn with something wet and brown. The empire was not conquered. It was not invaded. It surrendered, not to Thorin's army, to his myth. But myths demand more than loyalty. They demand truth. And Thorin, he was about to prove his was real. For every empire that kneels, there are always those who refuse to bow. They called themselves the Iron Circle, a secret alliance of judges, generals, and mystics hidden deep within the bureaucracy of the empire. Some were true skeptics. Others feared the Blood Priest, not for his rituals, but for how effective they were. They believed Thorin was no prophet, no god, just a master manipulator. A boy raised on whispers and fear. A man who understood something terrifying. That belief, once infected with dread, becomes its own weapon. And so they conspired. Their plan was precise. Thorn would be exposed. Not assassinated, not martyred. That would only elevate him. Instead, they would discredit him publicly. A ritual was announced, the Crimson Trial, to be held in the Empire's largest amphitheater. 30,000 would attend. Millions would hear the outcome. But this time, it wasn't Thorn's ritual. It was theirs. A display of logic, science, disillusionment. They invited the blood priest to perform in the presence of scholars, physicians, and alchemists. Thorn accepted. The stage was built under a full moon. The bowl, inspected by royal guards. The blade, examined by skeptics. The offering, a condemned criminal sentenced to death for mass murder. Everything was controlled, measured, sanitized. And yet, as Thorn stepped onto the stage, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. Spectators shivered. A hound howled in the distance. The condemned man, once arrogant, began to shake. Thorn said nothing. He turned to the crowd and smiled. Then he whispered to the criminal, 3 words no one could hear. The man began to weep. Not cry, not sob. Weep, as if something inside him shattered. He begged for death, screamed for it. When Thorn raised the blade, the man reached for it himself. The cut was deep. The blood spilled into the bowl, and the bowl caught fire, not with smoke or heat, but with red flame, fluid, writhing, almost alive. The audience panicked. The guards moved in, only to find the bowl cool to the touch. No burns, no trique, but the criminal was dead. His eyes melted in his skull. The trial was over. The Iron Circle's plan had failed, but Thorn wasn't done. He turned to the High Scholar, head of the Imperial Academy, and asked, if you believe only in what you can explain, explain this. He lifted his left hand. His skin peeled back, revealing veins shaped like ancient glyphs. They pulsed, then faded. The scholar fell to his knees. The next day, the Academy shut down indefinitely. Within a week, 12 members of the Iron Circle were found dead. 3 drowned in shallow water. 4 vanished from locked rooms. 1 was found suspended from a ceiling by vines that grew from inside his body. No one claimed responsibility. Everyone knew who had sent the message. Still, a final skeptic remained, General Val, commander of the Eastern Legions. A man who had seen more war than any living soul in the Empire. He did not fear Thorn's blood. He feared what might happen if no one resisted. He issued a challenge. Come to the Eastern Plains. Alone. No veils. No bowls. If you're what they claim, I will kneel. If you are not, you will die. The Empire held its breath. Thorn answered with silence. And then he walked. 2 weeks. Across dry deserts and frigid mountains. Barefoot. Alone. On the 15th day, he arrived. Eris stood waiting, armored and surrounded by archers. But Thorn spoke first. Do not bow to me. Bow to the thing I serve. He struck the earth with his palm, and the sky opened, not with rain, but with screams, a sound no man should hear. The archers fled. Eris did not. Instead, he dropped his weapon, fell to his knees, and whispered, "What are you?" Thorn replied, "I am not it. I am its echo." The next morning, General Val lit his own fortress on fire. He burned inside with his entire family. The only thing found in the ashes was a bowl, untouched, unbroken, still wet. The Empire no longer resisted. The blood priest no longer asked. He commanded, and the final ritual was about to begin. The final ritual was never officially recorded. There are no imperial scrolls. No scribes were allowed to witness it. No survivors were expected. But whispers always survive. They say it happened on the night of hollow moons, when the sky lost all color, and even the stars seemed to vanish behind an invisible veil. A darkness that felt thick. A silence that felt alive. And in that silence, Thorn called the earth to bleed. The chosen acolytes had spent weeks preparing the site, a massive circle carved into the barren wastelands, lined with stones etched in languages long lost. Dozens of bowls were placed in spirals, each filled with blood gathered from the marked, those selected by the Red Veil from every corner of the Empire. No one resisted. By then, submission was not fear. It was faith. The ritual began with no sound, no chanting, no fire, just the slow raising of Thorin's hand. And then the ground opened, but not in a quake. It peeled like flesh from bone. From that open wound of the earth, a sound emerged, not heard by ears, but by the soul. Some dropped dead. Others dropped to their knees and screamed until they ruptured their own throats. Witnesses say a black mist spilled upward and hung above the land like an unblinking eye. What was, no one can say. But one phrase was etched into the rocks afterward, in blood that refused to dry. It has returned. The debt is remembered. Then Thorin vanished. Not killed, not buried, simply gone. Some believe he walked into the wound in the earth and was consumed by the very god he served. Others say he never existed at all, that he was a vessel used and discarded by an ancient force that had merely slept. But the world did not go back to normal. Not entirely. The empire survived, technically, but its people did not. Entire cities became ghost towns. Ritual altars stilled the countryside, even in ruins. And the Temple of Ash in Kerith, still standing, is said to weep red liquid on the anniversary of the ritual. The Red Veil? They still walk. Sightings continue to this day. Figures in crimson robes, faceless, standing in forests at dusk. At the edge of lakes. In empty churches. Always watching. Never moving. And then there are the bowls. Over 400 have been recovered worldwide. Identical in shape, blackened with age, wet with a substance that resists analysis. Many believe Thorin is gone, but some, they believe he is merely dormant, waiting for the next eclipse, waiting for belief to swell again. Because belief is blood, and blood always calls. What if the darkest rituals in human history didn't come from madness, but from perfect understanding of what fear does to the human soul? Thorin wasn't just a priest. He was a mirror, a reflection of how far people will go when they believe the alternative is chaos. And maybe, just maybe, he touched something real. The story of the Blood Priest isn't a warning from the past. It's a question. How much would you give if you believed it would save you? We may never know what truly happened on that night. But the spirals are still being found. The symbols are still being etched. And deep beneath the soil, something may still be listening. If this story left you unsettled, fascinated, or questioning everything, you're not alone. Subscribe for more forgotten horrors, hidden histories, and shocking truths that were never meant to be remembered. Drop a comment below. Do you believe Thorin was real? Or was just a legend gone too far? And if you dare, watch the next video. It's darker,